Welcome to 5 Minutes with God. I'm Steve Campbell. We've come to a very unique section of the book of Romans as we look at chapter 9. In chapter 8, we had seen this pinnacle of joy as we considered the love of God. But in chapter 9, Paul says, there's something I'm sad about. I have continual grief in my heart, in verse 2, he says. And he begins to recount all the beautiful promises and covenants and revelations of glory that God had shown to his people in the past. The nation of Israel, the Jewish scriptures, are filled with all of these historical references to God's glory. And one of these promises that Paul remembers in verse 5 is that there was going to be a Messiah. Paul had heard about this growing up. He was of Jewish heritage. Religiously and culturally, this was the hope of Israel. And all the first followers of Jesus were also of Jewish heritage and had seen the marks of the Messiah, heard his words, and saw the acts in his life and in his death and his resurrection. Paul himself had been violently opposed to believing in Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ. And yet he had come also to believe that the marks of the Messiah were plain. But as a nation, the people of Israel had not displayed wholesale acceptance of those claims. And so now Paul says, well, what is God going to do about all those promises and covenants? He says in verse 6, it is not that the word of God has become ineffective, and he begins to explore this principle that God always has acted in sovereign purpose to accomplish his plans. And he begins to look at this in the history of the people of Israel themselves. When God called Abraham, there were two sons in Abraham's family, Ishmael and Isaac, and God sovereignly declared, in Isaac your seed will be called. He's the son of promise. Isaac had two sons, and God sovereignly declared, the older shall serve the younger, verses 11 and 12. And verse 11 could be considered the key verse of this chapter, that even before those boys were born, Jacob and Esau, God had made a declaration. They hadn't done good, they hadn't done evil. It was just, verse 11, that the purpose of God, according to election, might stand. Not election in a political sense, but as an expression of God's sovereign choice. And we have to be very precise as we look at this subject, because some have accused God of being unfair or unjust. For example, verse 13 records God's words when he said, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Is that being unfair? And it's not, because in verse 13, this quote comes more than 1,000 years after Esau's life. This is God's assessment of what Esau became. Esau came to be someone who rejected God's blessings, despised them. He came to be someone who in his family, they took a position of being enemies of God and enemies of the descendants of Jacob. They fought wars against Jacob's family, who became the nation of Israel. Did God force Esau to despise his blessings? Did God force the family of Esau to fight against Israel? Certainly not. God is not unrighteous, as it says in verse 14. Another example is in the life of Pharaoh. That Egyptian ruler had been told by the Lord, let my people go from slavery. Pharaoh said, who's the Lord? I'm going to do what I want. I don't care what you say. And this defiant ruler got his wish. He was hardened, it says in verse 18. His heart was hardened. This is described in Exodus. But God did not force Pharaoh to be defiant. He simply gave Pharaoh the results and consequences of his choices. God does not force anybody to be defiant. So there's a skeptic that comes up in verse 19 then who says, well, why does God find fault with me? In other words, God should just make me believe. If he's so powerful, why doesn't he just make me believe him? Force me to believe him. But that's not how God does things. That's not a real relationship at all. And the answer in verse 20 is, listen, we don't get to tell God how to do things. God is going to make his own choices. And even when he makes choices, it's always on the side of mercy. In verse 22, there are those who are called the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. But it doesn't say that God made them vessels of wrath. It doesn't say that he prepared them for destruction. Look at what God is doing. He is enduring with much long suffering. He doesn't want destruction to come to them. Yes, he prepared some for glory, verse 23, but he never forces anyone to reject him. Both of these lines of teaching are true in the scriptures, and it's important to emphasize that both are accurate and are expressions of God's character. In verse 25 through 29, we see that God's words through the prophets have always been that he will accomplish his purposes. He has plans for his people. And in verses 30 to 33, it says that even the Gentiles have been brought in on the basis of faith. That's God's way. The righteousness of faith is going to be God's way. And God, even though his ways have been rejected by those who have stumbled at the claims of Jesus the Messiah, there is going to be a way for God to fulfill his purposes. And this will be developed further in chapter 10 and 11.